Welcome to One for the Road. I'm Devvy Kid and your commentator. One for the Road was developed and created to help the busy commuter and Americans who don't have access to the internet find out what Congress and the media won't tell you. This next segment is very important. It's called Why an Income Tax is Not Necessary to Fund the U.S. Government. Can this statement possibly be true? In order to answer this question, Americans must first understand what the source of the money that funds the government is and where it goes. Contrary to the sound bites issued by the two mainstream political parties, the reality of how the system actually works will not only open your eyes, but hopefully stimulate the American people to demand that the thievery underway comes to an end. Understanding the income tax hoax. This informational tool is not for the purpose of educating Americans on the voluntary federal income tax. We encourage each and every individual to investigate this insidious second plank of the Communist Manifesto so that they might understand the grievous wrong done by Congress to the people over the past 88 years. Where do your income tax dollars go? The best place to look for an answer to this question would be a government report. So let's just take one at random. This report is titled President's Private Sector Survey on Cost Control, a report to President Ronald Reagan, dated January 15, 1984. It is available from the Congressional Research Service. The excerpt below is found on page 12. This document is also found in the reading room on my website, www.devvy.com. Page 12. Point 1. Importantly, any meaningful increase in taxes from personal income would have to come from lower and middle income families, as 90% of all personal taxable income is generated below the taxable income level of $35,000. Point 2. Further, there isn't much more that can be extracted from high income brackets. If the government took 100% of all taxable income beyond the $75,000 tax bracket not already taxed, it would only get $17 billion, and this confiscation, which would destroy productive enterprise, would be only sufficient to run the government for several days. Point 3 of this report to President Reagan. Resistance to additional income taxes would be even more widespread if people were aware that, with 2/3 of everyone's personal income taxes wasted or not collected, 100% of what is collected is absorbed solely by interest on the federal government contributions to payments, transfer payments, and the national debt. In other words, all individual income tax revenues are gone before one nickel is spent on the services which taxpayers expect from their government. End of quote from page 12. How can that be? In order to answer this question, an individual must learn how the privately owned Federal Reserve or central bank actually works. In a nutshell, this is how the scam works, and I'm going to give you an excerpt from Debt Virus by a brilliant man named Dr. Jacques Jacquemin on page 216 of his book. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 requires the central bank to return a small portion of its unconstitutional gains to the U.S. Treasury. Here's an example of the numbers. In 1988, the Federal Reserve has an income of $19.5 billion, and it turned back $17.36 billion to the U.S. Treasury as provided under its charter. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 provided that a substantial portion of the Fed's annual profits be turned over to the National Treasury. Does this fact dilute the argument that there are vast profits built into the commercial banking system? No. Consider for a moment that the total public debt versus private debt at the end of 1988 was in excess of $11 trillion. And of course, today, and I wrote this paper 3 years ago, today the debt is in excess of $44 trillion. The discount rate at which banks can borrow from the Federal Reserve banks at that time was 9.4%. Assuming the debt carried the same rate as the discount rate, there was an annual interest charge of almost $1 trillion on the total debt owed to the banking system. While all of this interest payment does not go to commercial banks, an overwhelmingly large part of it does. And that's the end of the excerpt. Our founding fathers, the ones our elected public servants are always chirping they respect, warned the American people about usury and unscrupulous bankers. Quote, "If the American people ever allow the banks to control the issuance of their currency, first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power of money should be taken from banks and restored to Congress and the people to whom it belongs. I sincerely believe the banking institutions having the issuing power of money are more dangerous to liberty than standing armies." Unquote, Thomas Jefferson. So what we have here is a central bank issuing worthless paper money that controls our economy, our lives, and our future. This private banking cartel was unconstitutionally granted this power by a devious, scheming group of senators back in 1913. In essence, what they did was place the American people into indentured servitude by forcing the people to pay usury on worthless fiat currency, which means paper money created out of nothing, not to fund the government, but to enrich the bankers and fund wars in which America should never be allowed. This system exists not to fund the government, but to allow the U.S. Congress carte blanche power to continue funding unconstitutional agencies and programs by providing them with a bottomless source of worthless ink. The national debt and the deficit. These two little bookkeeping items are not the same thing. Few Americans actually know the difference, but the difference is quite important. We continually hear members of Congress, president after president, and political pundits call for reduction in the debt. But what does that really mean? Here's how it works in the most simplified way to fit into this document. Let's say that for 2002, Congress and the President decide they want $1.7 trillion to fund this bloated pig called our government. We know that 100% of all personal income taxes extorted by the IRS goes to the privately owned Federal Reserve banking system and does not fund a single function of the government. So let's take the people's blood and sweat off the table. What other revenues does the government collect? Corporate taxes, Social Security taxes, constitutional revenues such as excise taxes on cigarettes, alcohol, tobacco, firearms, tires, etc., tariffs on trade, military hardware sales, and some other minor categories. Let's say that those revenues will total $900 billion. The politicians want $1.7 trillion to spend on their favorite welfare programs, wars and foreign welfare, but have a shortfall of $800 billion. This is called the deficit, and the deficit created by the spending of Congress creates the national debt. How? Because the politicians are $800 billion short, they simply call up Alan Greenspan and borrow your children and grandbabies' futures. The privately owned Federal Reserve banks don't loan anything of value to Congress. They aren't banks. They're really an overpaid, powerful cabal operating as a private accounting service. When that $800 billion worth of ink is transferred to the Treasury, it gets piled on top of the existing national debt. How? Because the politicians are $800 billion short, they simply call up Alan Greenspan and borrow your children and grandbabies' futures.